look out though, it helps the window. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Howe,
Here.
Walter,
Here.
Carter, here.
All right, we got a couple of things on the agenda tonight. First, we're gonna hear about a planned development district proposal. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Scott, let him introduce our guests tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. With the planned development district regulations, it requires a concept plan to be presented to staff for review and feedback. Then the developer also has the option to go before planning commission and or development committee for their review and feedback as well. So they did meet with us on May 24th, or staff on May 24th, and then were presented to the planning commission on June 5th. So here's the third step in the process where they can meet with the development committee for feedback. So attached to what I passed out is the concept plan, then also has a map showing the existing zoning map and then the future land use map. And there's also some general statistics on the under number 1 of the development committee report. So I'll turn it over to these gentlemen and they can take it from there.
Good evening. I'm Todd Ferris of Ferris Planning and Design. Thank you for having us here tonight. We have, do they have the whole packet that we're going to kind of present, or they do?
Yeah,
Okay.
what was
Okay.
distributed for planning and zoning.
Okay. On the screen, and you can look at on your all the gel on your desk, but on the screen, I'll kind of go through this. Now, we've reoriented it from what's in your packet so it would fit on the screen. It's one thing I did learn so far, so your screen's pretty big this way. But anyway, this site, as far as context is concerned, north is to the left. My left, yes, my left. So that's to the north. Limited Brands is just south of our site. We are actually right at the border of the Columbus and the Pataskala Corporation boundary limit line. So that is our western property line. What we are looking at is about 65 acres on this site, and we are proposing a mixed-use development. Now, my client, Metro Development, has been in business since mid-60s, maybe a little bit more than that. Joe can get into more detail on it. Joe Thomas with Metro Development's here as well. But they have done a variety of projects, anywhere from single-family, multifamily, commercial, industrial, you name it, they've done it. And they have been very successful at doing mixed-use developments. Now, on this site, we are proposing a mixture of commercial along the frontage of Broad Street, about 6 acres. Then immediately behind that and adjacent to the industrial, we'd be looking at a pod of multifamily of 262 units, which would have a clubhouse, pool, associated parking garages with that, as well as trash compactor, mail kiosk, etc. Just that would be associated with an apartment complex. And more closer, adjacent to the existing residential, then we have proposed 102 lots, single family, more of a cluster approach with a 52-foot by 120-foot depth lots. That we would incorporate within the site and retain a significant buffer adjacent to the existing residential to the east. Our main entry would be off of Broad Street. We're proposing a new entry there, which is equidistant between the two existing streetlights. We would also propose some right-in, right-out curb cuts. Obviously, we still need to deal with ODOT on the location and if these are signalized or not on all these things, but preliminarily, this is what we've been looking at. Now, we have 2 other access points to Taylor Road, which is due east of us. Those access points we are looking at as being emergency only, where they would be constructed to look generally like pedestrian pathway, either have knockdown bollards or gates or whatever the fire department so requests or needs at that point in time. Just keeping in mind that the people on Taylor probably do not want cut-through traffic to go from our development to that. Big enough to do that. We did have some comments at Planning Commission where they thought that that may make sense to have vehicular traffic, but right now we're steering clear of that, knowing that that probably brings up a lot of consternation amongst the people that live there. This would generally be developed as one phase. The commercial and multifamily would go in simultaneously with the roadway for the single family. I don't know if all the lots for the single family would be developed at once. There may be a split in it, maybe at that cul-de-sac between the two lakes. But generally speaking, most of the infrastructure would be put in within the first phase, and then the single family could be phased in 2 phases. Now, we also have some exhibits that detail the architectural character. What we're seeing and what we have been working with lately for the single family is just a combination of different architectural styles, but with an emphasis of porches and colonnades at the front of the home, just to give them a presence on the streets. We also see that there's some streetscape examples of what those would look like. There's an example of the multifamily buildings. These are all 3-story, 24-unit buildings with a mixture of 1 and 2-bedroom units. Predominantly 2 bedrooms with about a 25 to 30% mix of 1 bedrooms within the development. We also have some details that just show the clubhouse, the architectural character of that as well, the garages, things like that. And then just some vignettes of what the commercial could be. Right now, we haven't done any marketing on this, but we know that we would provide some multi-tenant buildings in the back portion of the front lot, the larger lot. It's a multi-tenant buildings, and then sell out parcels in the front. And the out parcels would be similar to freestanding restaurants or banks, things of those nature. Again, mixed use. I think mixed use makes a lot of sense in this location. We know Broad Street is busy as it is, so this would help reduce trips in and out of the site. Wouldn't alleviate all of them, but it certainly would help. And we also know that just in conversations with the seller, which is the limited, they would be very appreciative of any housing that's closer to their headquarters, because their employees and other employees in the area that have to drive farther and farther to work is just not something that they want to have people closer to home, and they see this as a benefit to them. And just with all the new businesses that are coming into that area and that are there today, there is quite a need in this general area. That's kind of the brief presentation of the overall site plan and the architectural character. I think Joe has some other information that he would like to go over about the company and some different items from that standpoint, I think.
Questions, mainly?
Questions?
Yeah.
Okay, and questions from you guys too, for sure. So,
Andy?
I can get into some specific questions if you want,
Sure.
Todd. Are you guys proposing public roads or private roads?
public roads throughout the single family, private, and the multifamily.
Multifamily. And behind the commercial on the 5.33 acres, you've got 2 large buildings, and I can't tell exactly what you're thinking those might be.
Those would be the multi-tenant buildings, so those would be like inline retail.
Strip center type stuff?
Yeah, strip center.
Okay, and then are you proposing to feed all the commercial sites from behind, essentially with a feeder road?
Yes, behind both of those, we do have a feeder road.
And would you be opposed, well, I know I see a couple right-in, right-outs, but that might be challenging on Broad Street.
It might be, but
Just
I'm gonna
saying,
start
not from
somewhere.
necessarily Pataska's point of view, but
Yeah,
from
yeah.
possibly others. Does that adversely affect your commercial sites if you can't get the right-in,
No,
right-out?
No, I don't think so.
Those are my initial questions.
Yeah.
Just one other one. How will you gate these? You said knock down bollards essentially for emergency access, but you know, as far as fire or emergency squad, have you run any of this past the fire department
We
in
have
any
not.
way? Or district, I guess I would say? I imagine this is Columbus, does anybody, you know, Scott, if this is Columbus Fire, or is this,
This should be West Licking.
Yeah,
West
this would be
Licking.
West Licking Fire.
okay. So West Licking obviously may have some comments about the length of the
I'm sure,
cul-de-sac,
yeah.
so, all right, thanks.
Okay.
Have you done any traffic studies? or
We have not done
anything?
any of that information.
Because I'm gonna tell you, that's my ward, and I live on that side of town, and this is completely unfeasible for the traffic that's over there now. Coming one entrance off Broad Street for not only the commercial, but all of that residential, it won't work. And honestly, the entrances off Taylor Road won't work either. So I was just wondering how much vetting you've done on that area before you put any work into it, because, or have they warned you about us ahead of time? Because this is not something that the city is looking for when it comes to that many multifamily housing units and the schools. I mean, it's a collective effort to build up our infrastructure to support more of what we already have and not bog it down with this. So I was curious what kind of research you did before.
Yeah, no, we have not done any traffic studies yet. We were told that there are traffic issues. So we know that there are, and we've been told that, and have heard what's going on with Task Club.
That's the most dangerous intersection in the city. It has
Yeah.
the most traffic deaths at that intersection.
And that's why we're here to discuss this before we submit anything formally. That was recommended that we come in informally to discuss the proposal. To get your feedback. That's exactly, and you're giving it to us.
Oh, I'll go, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
That's all I got.
Is that all I have? I have an issue with the size of the lots.
Okay.
You know, we're, the small lots are just not something that I feel like there's much of an appetite for here in the city. Would you be amenable to expanding the size of the lots and reducing the overall number of lots? Would that be something you would?
But that's
Be willing
something that
to-
we definitely take into consideration, for sure, yeah.
Anything else? Okay. That's all I got.
Any comments?
No, but thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we know we'd have to do a full traffic study and look at that, the feasibility and everything else.
There are countless issues
Mhm.
in that exact area. Traffic, drainage, the size of the roads, I mean, you name it,
Mhm.
and it's already a problem. So, in addition to the, extreme overcrowding of our local schools, the fact that people on Taylor Road already cannot get in and out of their driveways, or other, commercial, but this is pretty large, have put in emergency exits to Taylor and now are fighting to have that for their employees to use it on a regular basis in and out of, interrupting residential traffic, cutting the light. The police have been against it. I live on that road a little further south, but I have seen it back up from Broad Street to the tracks at Cleveland. I mean, it's already ridiculous.
Yeah,
So I just don't even, and turning left or right out of a complex right onto Broad Street, that's a tall one.
yeah, unfortunately, we can't go straight, but, no, we know that there's challenges and hurdles for sure.
Right. Yeah, especially with the traffic issue, you know, trying to find a way to turn left out of there at 5:30 in the evening, just, I just don't see that as a real possibility. That's just gonna snarl traffic even more than it already is in that area.
Mhm.
That's gonna be, a hard issue to overcome.
Right, and obviously it would be, I'm assuming it would require an in-depth traffic study of some sort, and I don't know what the mitigation could or would be. I mean,
Right.
I'd not fathom, it could be extra turn lane, we don't know.
Right.
So, we have no clue.
Sorry, Joe Thomas with Metro Development. Todd has obviously explained to you as far as our proposal that's here tonight. Kind of want to discuss open options with the city of Pataskla, understanding that the current traffic in this area is already of some concern.
Right.
And there's probably no feasible way, as development sits right now, to pay for those traffic improvements. I don't know if there's a long-term plan from the city of Pataskla for any kind of infrastructure improvements in that area, or bonding, or some type of funds for that area. But one thing that we did look at, and we worked with Bricker, who's a firm in Central Ohio that looks at these pretty closely, is tip options. And we might possibly have a solution not only for our community itself, but the area infrastructure. Just running some basic numbers for on the multifamily and the commercial application only, and excluding the single family. On a TIF finance authority for that particular area, it would generate roughly $7.3 million of infrastructure funds for the city of Pataskla. That's of course over a 30-year period, and would be a non-school TIF, so all the funds that existing that go to the school would still be in place. So the schools would be made whole as far as their tax implication of this particular property, and then the balance of funds would be used at the discretion of the city of Pataskla for infrastructure improvements. So I just want to let you know there's a possible opportunity for Pataskla to benefit and not have any adverse effect to the school districts. We know that everywhere around Central Ohio there's complications with traffic and complications with school crowding, but we believe that the commercial wouldn't have an adverse effect on the school, but a positive effect in the sense of generating income through the property taxes. And then we look at our multifamily, it has a small footprint on school population, roughly about 10% of the unit structure to generate students for the actual school district. So somewhere close to 27 students through the actual apartment community. And then, from the standpoint of single family, we heard you as far as the size of lots. Throughout the area, and I'm sure you've heard it numerous times about the marketability of larger lots. We have done our due diligence working with Ryan Homes, Westport, MI, Rockford, Homewood, and from the standpoint of the marketability of lot sizes, we have, if the 52-foot wide lots aren't acceptable, is there somewhere, from a larger lot down to basically a median lot size that would be acceptable to Pataskla? From a standpoint, even in other areas, we, see the trend that it used to be 85-foot wide lots, and then the trend went down to 70 or 75-foot lots, and then it continues to a 65-foot lot. But people were, in the housing market, and not the house builders themselves, but the buyers in the end are looking for a smaller, manageable lot, but with a similar house style on top of that lot, and looking for something that's not draining their resources as far as time and money and effort to maintain that area. So, if the 50-foot wide lot's not acceptable to Pataskla, is there a smaller lot footprint other than 1 acre lots that are acceptable? That's of discussion, or is it just simply?
I don't know. Personally, I'm north of 70 at least.
Okay.
Foot lots. Because we have, in Pataskla we have a line of developers, looking at Pataskla for different developments, and they're all coming with the cluster kind of concept of the smaller lots. And my issue is that I don't want to just keep trying to cram as many houses into as little space as we can, and we find that we have trouble keeping up with infrastructure and all this kind of stuff. And again, schools are a concern of mine, overwhelming the schools. So for me personally, I'm north when it comes to the lot size. 70 is probably like the minimum.
Now, would there be a tolerance of empty nesters on private streets, or something similar to, getting rid of the fee simple concept and doing, basically single-family detached condos on private streets that won't necessarily stress the infrastructure of Pataska, but will be on the private development side for the association to maintain the roads, the curbs, the sidewalks, the infrastructure, the storm. A lot of times the local sewer and water district would maintain the sewer or water no matter what type of development there is. So that, of course, comes at a continual fee to the end user.
Right.
But, as far as that type of product in general, is that something that would be more readily acceptable? It doesn't drain on the resources of the city of Pataska long-term on infrastructure maintenance.
I think that may be something that, we're a little more open to, but it's still not gonna solve issues when it comes like traffic and that kind of thing. Rob?
I would, personally, I disagree. We just unanimously voted a development down. And with the same things, you can't guarantee that only empty nesters will live in those houses. You can't guarantee that there's going to be a successful, homeowners association. It doesn't help with the amount of police we have on the roads, or our intersections, or the school overcrowding. And the school overcrowding isn't just, a thing we toss out there. We are the fourth fastest growing school district in the state of Ohio. I mean, our schools, we are building a new high school, and at the rate we're going, it will be full in 5 years, and we'll need another school. We cannot absorb the people and the kids. So, the only way I'm open to things of this nature is if I have a developer who comes in and who's willing to front substantial improvements. I would need to see a substantial improvement to the Taylor Broad intersection, and to Taylor Road itself. I would need to see a heavy reduction in the multifamily units. It would take a great deal for me to be able to get on board with that. And that's coming directly from the side of town who, my residents are sick of not being able to get out of their driveways, or get through a stop sign, or get their kid to school. So this kind of thing would not go over well on the west side of town.
Andy?
Well, I just wanted to correct one thing. It was 6-1 on that vote, by the way.
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay. I just wanted to correct, I just wanted to mention that.
Andy.
That's okay. Can I ask Scott a quick question? Scott, this is R20 now.
Mm-hmm.
So on 65 acres, what's the simple math to say, I may not be taking all the GB into particular, but let's say on 60 acres, what does R20 allow?
It would be half-acre lots, more or less.
Okay, so essentially you'd be able to get somewhere around 120 units on this, just flat out single family, if you could figure out the traffic, and that's a huge piece of this puzzle, is figuring out the traffic, because as Mel's mentioned, and Mike, you've got Broad Street that's just a cluster, basically, and that's hard to get over. Even if you were able to put together a really nice TIF opportunity for the city, obviously $7 million over 30 years is not anything to sneeze at, and could go a long way to fixing some traffic problems in this area. Still, the upfront stuff it's hard. It would have to be something where those improvements were made up front, and you guys got paid back through the TIF.
Okay.
So it is a disaster out there right now.
Okay.
So that's
Thank
about the best I can tell you. I wouldn't want you to go too much further to look to the site unless you can come up with a really creative way of getting the traffic through this area.
Just two things. Andy hit on one, reimbursement TIF. I was gonna mention as a way, 30 years to collect 7.3, that takes a while, so I don't know if there'd be a way to do that. The other, just out of curiosity, what is the price point as presented of the single family houses here?
I'd say average starting 350.
Okay.
It's pretty consistent. Just talking to Jack Montino on Thursday afternoon, he's hitting that price point a little bit higher on single family. They're a little bit lower on his doubles
Yeah.
at Westport, but they're consistently seeing them.
I know his development here is doing well,
Yeah,
right around that.
now he's looking for a replacement site,
Okay.
because it's doing so well.
Yeah.
And he's looking for something similar, and this would be a nice fit for them
Okay.
as a replacement site, fit right in. And that's why I was asking about the lot sizes, because, the traditional builders nowadays, you know, they're not out to create the market, they're just responding to it. So it's one of those opportunities that they're looking at, you know, maybe a similar price point that used to be a 75-foot lot, is now a smaller lot because of the cost of construction, so.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Mel, you have anything else?
No.
Andy?
Nope, that's all for me, thanks.
Well, we really appreciate the opportunity tonight, and thank you for your impact, and then your
Thank you for
your
coming.
comments, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, gentlemen. Preferably no. Thank you, sir.
Taking the keyboard?
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All right, Scott, you wanna go ahead and, kind of fill us in on where you are as far as, impact fees are concerned? I know we had a brief discussion about this the other night, and turns out that it's a little more complicated than everyone kind of thought it would be. So kind of just fill us in on the problems you're finding, with the direction we need to go.
So when we initially thought about these were, how do we impose these? What's the best course of action? Is there somebody, a neighboring community that we can apply those from them to us? Is it a smooth transition? And the more we dug into it, it's a very complex situation with what would need to be done. So essentially impact fees that, when I put here the general definition of what those are, is the development pays for costs of providing facilities in, as a way when there's growth. So if there's an intersection, there should be they're having an impact, there needs to be an equation to calculate the impact and therefore the cost of the developer to improve that intersection. And I did find an article that I've attached to your packet that kind of goes through on a very general standpoint in terms of what impact fees are, how they're calculated, and how they're implemented. So from reviewing this, there seems to be two ways in order to calculate impact fees. So there's the inductive calculation, which if you look at an improvement and the cost to do that, then you make that the baseline for all future improvements. So for example, if we said Broad Mink, that improvement was $1 million, then we say Broad Columbia, Broad Summit, all those would be $1 million, and we apply the impact fees based upon that calculation. The other one is the deductive calculation, where then you identify things that areas that need to be improved, and we'll just go back to intersections. So if we say we need to improve Mink and Broad, that's $1 million, but if we need to do Broad and Summit, that's $500,000. So it would be site specific in terms of what needs to be done. So there's two ways to calculate those. And I mentioned there's the article that includes, here's just a general overview of what impact fees are, how they're implemented. There's also several legal aspects to implementing impact fees. So in the article, it'll talk about Florida, Texas, California. They have state law that indicates here's how and when you can apply impact fees. The state of Ohio has no such legislation, but there's a lot of case law where they focus on the municipality's authority to impose impact fees and also the reasonableness of the amount of the fee charged versus the cost of the improvement. So if we did impact fees like it's $2 a lot, I don't think anybody would bat an eye. If we do, it's $1 million a lot, I think that's pretty excessive. But from our research, we don't know where the tipping point is. Where is it, that's reasonable versus you had 10 more bucks, that's unreasonable. So what the city of Pickerington did is they hired a consultant to look through, and I've attached the ordinance where they adopted the impact fees and the study from their consultant. They looked through and kind of came up with, here's the improvements, here's what things cost, here's a reasonable way and a legal way that you can impose impact fees on developers. So from our standpoint, we're looking to see, based on what they did, can we reverse engineer this to see, okay, here's your methodology, here's how you came up with these numbers, can the city then kind of use this study and plug in our own numbers based upon the city's needs? And I don't have an answer for that yet, because as you can see, it's pretty complicated, and once we started delving into this, it got more and more difficult. So we're trying to learn the process and how this works, but with a lot of the studies, calculations, legal ramifications, it keeps becoming more and more complex the farther we get into it. I do want to mention that we are meeting with a consultant tomorrow afternoon, just to go over impact fees process, what needs to be done, just as a way to learn from a staff's perspective to see, you know, I'm not in class with professors saying, here's how impact fees work, and if I have questions I can ask. It's basically just reading through articles, you know, state law books, things like that I have available and trying to teach myself. So it's a little slow going at this point, but hopefully we'll have a little bit more insight tomorrow when we can talk to a consultant that is familiar with impact fees and how they're implemented and created.
Okay, well, that's a lot to, I can't wait to dive into this.
Good bedtime reading, I
Yeah,
assume.
right.
I'm gonna ask for the Cliff Notes version of that. Do we know how much Pickerington paid for a consultant to do all of that? I mean,
I don't know, I don't think it was in the ordinance, but I don't have that information, because they did theirs in 2005, so getting some of that, I assume over the years, trying to get some of the materials went away. I'm assuming they have a contract somewhere, but it was a little difficult getting this.
I would be interested in knowing what it would cost for us to have a consultant help us put one together in a way that, we wouldn't end up having, you know, to fight any legal fees or anything, you know, of that nature. It's just me.
So it sounds like from what you, your research, you found that it's still kind of like, when it comes to impact fees, it's still kind of a legal gray area. Like there's nothing really solid, really like the solid definition of impact fees. It's kind of, you know, it kind of varies from municipality to municipality, state to state, and each state kind of has their own way to govern it. And there's some states, I just from a quick Google search have ruled that they're not legal. That they, like Minnesota was.
Minnesota.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's kind of an interesting path to try and walk.
With, like, for example, if we use Florida, and then they have state statutes that we could refer to and say, here's the framework we need to abide by to make sure that, you know, we comply with the law. But with Ohio, as there are none, it's all set seemingly through precedent with case law. So I think we could get some direction that way, but it does make it a little bit more difficult. And also, from what I understand, any impact fees we charge, so for example, if we were to look at Heron Manor, and let's say there was impact fees, if we were to charge that, there would have to be a direct benefit to the developer. So if that money, they were gonna impact Columbia and Broad to a certain extent, then you could have a direct benefit to the developer with the improvement of that intersection. But if we were to try and say, we're gonna take your impact fees from your development and apply it to Summit and Broad, I think there might be some issues. I mean, granted, you could say that folks from there will be using the Summit and Broad intersection, but it's more difficult to tie it together as a direct benefit to their development.
So it's almost like if, let's say we had 4 developments come in, there was one at Mink and Broad, Heron Manor, Refugee and Mink, and then, you know, wherever else, there would be like, we would have to maintain 4 separate accounts for.
That is my thought, but I haven't gotten far enough to talk to Jamie to say, what would the process from a financial standpoint, what would the process need to be in order for them to do it? My thought is yes. I think if we identify maybe a few areas and there's funds set up specifically for those areas, and then when the time's right, we could apply the money towards those improvements, but I don't think we could put it into one pot of money and draw from that.
BJ?
Yeah, and TIF seems to be a theme tonight, but I know those better, but it seems to me, looking into this, it's similar to that. When you create a TIF, you create a district or an area that the TIF collection dollars can specifically provide, improvements for. If you look at our State Route 310 TIF, it's pretty broad what you can do there. So those are some of the questions I plan to ask tomorrow. I'm looking forward to meeting with the consultant. And also, and I don't know if it'll happen, just try to get some clarity on this whole legal issue. Where does it say what we can do, what we can't? Isn't even that clear. But, you know, with the direct benefit, and I understand what Scott's saying, but I liken it to, the more I read about this stuff, almost a TIF district where you say, from this area to this area, the funds can be used to put in, to make improvements in that area.
Okay.
But I get clarification on that tomorrow.
Well, I think that's a reasonable assumption, that, you know, if you're gonna charge somebody an impact fee, that it would be as the impact to the area where they'll be developing. So, I mean, I don't necessarily,
Maybe I'm unreasonable, but I guess my impression was that it would all, like, we could just charge an impact, that there would be an impact fee and it would go into a general fund, and we could use that to, just like, it's a road impact fee, and so we could use it to improve, you know, roads wherever, or intersections wherever they needed improved. So I was obviously mistaken in that, so.
And that's, and again, that's my understanding, and I don't know, there may be something available in that
Yeah.
regard, but I think we'd have to make sure it's legal to do
Absolutely,
that way.
absolutely.
well, and while it's probably more work on our part, I think the deductive option is better. I mean, I think just a blanket amount for every spot isn't reasonable, because I mean, we could have something that was a lot smaller than the thing coming, you know?
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I just think it's more, probably be more work on the front end, but having the fee fit the level of their impact.
I agree, and also looking through these, for a subdivision, say there's a new subdivision, some folks clearly, and I think that's arguably our intent, is that if you're gonna have an impact of, 300 cars per day at these intersections, that, we need some help in offsetting that. But some communities have gone so far as, if you have 10 acres and you build a house, those folks are susceptible to impact fees. So there's varying levels of what impacts are, because in some of the research they talk about, like, looking at your future land use map or your existing zoning map, that you can base some of those calculations on that. I don't know if someone builds a house on 10 acres, is that the route we want to go? Also, we look, from a commercial standpoint, if they're building the Kroger's complex, I think there should be impact fees. But if there's, a store that goes out and a new store goes in, are they responsible for impact fees? So there's a lot of variables and unanswered questions in terms of how far to go with it, how far legally can we go with it, some of those, it's just still a lot of questions.
And I think another question is who determines the level of impact? Is that do we determine that? Does the developer determine that through whatever kind of traffic study or whatever it may be? How is that determined?
In Pickerington, for example, they'll talk about if you have a building of X square feet, if it's 10,000 square feet for this building, that will produce these additional burdens on the city for the growth, and then that's how it's calculated. So
Okay.
some of it can go from building size, and we've discussed internally with traffic impact that if it's gonna be, the improvement for the intersection is $1 million, this development is gonna impact it 10%, therefore $100,000 should go into the fund to offset the cost of their impact.
So it's predetermined based upon the amount of houses, the size, or the size of a business, and it's not something that's done like on a case by case basis. So like, so if someone's gonna build, a strip mall out here on Broad Street, we wouldn't have to go and determine the impact based upon their plans. It's something that's already determined, will already be determined based upon the size of whatever they're building and what they're building.
That's correct. It would come down to essentially, here's the study would then determine impact, and then it would become it would be fair on both sides to know if I'm building this, we could do our own calculations and determine, so that way it's fair for both sides that
Okay.
there's no fuzzy math, here's how this came to pass. So it would be just like our fee schedule, if you wanna build a shed, it's $50, you wanna build 2 sheds, it's $100, just so it's, you know, very transparent and fair to those involved.
Okay. Any other?
Just looking through the information, which is a lot of reading, but, one thing that strikes me is that it doesn't take into account anything about low-income housing versus, you know, the 5-acre McMansions.
Mhm.
So, it's hard to charge, I think it'd be hard to charge, for a, you know, a disadvantaged or low-income housing, which all cities need to have that or provide for it. The same as you're charging, you know, the large house that may be on a large acre lot. I mean, I don't know, I didn't see anything that differentiated in here through a quick review.
Not to my knowledge, but I'm assuming, just like with anything, if there was a percentage of your development that was low, you know, income housing, that there could be a reduction of impact fees. I think there's a lot of ways to structure this, so it's just difficult without having a state statute to have a framework in place to have a starting point.
I think it also, you know, so let's go the other route with it to what we just heard about, which would be, I'm gonna say 55 and older, the guaranteed 55 and older. Not the marketed to the 55 and older, but the ones that are going through the federal program to make it 55 and older. That seems to be, they may be more impact on things like emergency care and so forth, but they may have zero or very little impact on traffic. So anyhow, this seems to be a pretty big challenge
Mm-hmm.
to try to negotiate.
That's why I think we're gonna have to really, it would have to be something very, it's gonna be complicated, which is why we probably need some help, that's all.
I would disagree, yeah. Cause I'd hate to go through this and teach myself and then realize I taught myself wrong,
Right.
and then open up a can of worms that way.
You know, and I know we already have impact fees, you know, in general, we have a park fee and we have different fees that are out there. How do those get in line with this? Is there just, would those be wiped off and then you say, you know, this is your impact fee and that's it? It's all inclusive?
There's multiple ways to do it. You know, we could have all that's calculated in is X goes to park, X goes to infrastructure, X goes to utilities, or you can do impact fees specifically, from my understanding, just for infrastructure. That could be it. So I think there's different ways to formulate these to address different concerns. And it's how much do you want to include, or how focused do you want it to be?
We've also talked about drainage and stormwater impact fees and some other ways of trying to help offset some of those costs. I didn't see anything in here for that necessarily. I saw vehicles and I saw other things, but what about projects that that are known? So I guess if I'm a developer, I come in and I know there's already a problem there. I didn't cause it, but you want to assess some kind of impact for, I'll just say drainage. And it's proven that that development doesn't cause any drainage issue whatsoever. It detains all its water, it does everything it's supposed to, doesn't put any kind of burden on the system. What happens with that? Is there an opt-out type of thing?
So I'm reading through these kind of now for the first time as well, but they're curing an existing shortfall or condition, and those impact fees for those uses are not valid as well.
Not permitted, okay.
It's the same, yeah.
So you couldn't say, okay, that's fine. That answers that. Thanks.
No? Do you know, does the existence of impact fees in any given place, do you know if that tends to deter developers from trying to develop there, or does it not affect them? Do they just pass along the cost to homeowners, or?
I'm sure it kind of works both ways, that if it's, you know, if it seems expensive, I'm assuming developers may not choose to develop, or it might be too expensive that they can't justify offsetting those costs by passing it on to the home buyer, for example. So I think that's kind of a sliding scale, that I think they could be crafted that they would, but I think they could be crafted that they could, either they pay it or they offset that to the home buyer.
Okay.
Well, or it offsets against the existing owner of the property, they deduct that from the existing property owner. So if it was $1 million and you're gonna charge $300,000 in impact fees, it's now gonna be $700,000. It works either way.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Anybody? Well, definitely, like I said, a lot more complicated than I thought it was gonna be. I look forward to hearing about your meeting tomorrow,
Mhm.
what you find out. If you could just, I mean, I'm sure you're gonna get a lot of information to be able to condense it down into a single email, maybe a little hard, but just, if you could send out an email maybe to all counselors, development committee, just some of the highlights, maybe some of the questions we asked tonight, some of those be clarified. But other than that, I wish you luck in trying to navigate this web of laws and everything else, so.
Yeah, I'll be sure to send that out once we've had our meeting, kind of condense it down to a palatable format.
Okay. Anybody have anything else? Scott, anything else?
No, sir.
Alright, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Powell,
Yes.
Carter,
Yes.
Walter.
Yes.